How's it going, everyone? Today we're going to be taking a look at the M1 Mac Mini, and the particular model that I have here is the baseline with 8 gigabytes of RAM and the 256 gigabyte SSD, and it came in right around $750 after taxes and whatnot. So anyway, let's go ahead and just take the top off here. First thing, of course, you see is the Mac Mini computer itself. But anyway, so let's go ahead and pull the tab and pull it up here. So as you can see, the design has effectively not changed at all with this iteration. So let's go ahead and set that off just briefly. Down here we have the real basic designed by Apple in California little quick start guide booklet. And then lastly is your basic power cable. Okay, getting back to the actual Mac Mini itself. Again, like I said, the design basically has not changed for several years. So let's go ahead and flip it over and take the plastic off. And then we do have on the back here another bit of plastic, so let's go ahead and take that off as well. There we go. So firstly, up on top here we have the basic black Apple logo, and on the front here we have just a single little indicator LED right there on the right hand side, and then all around the sides of it there is absolutely nothing until you get to the back of it. This is where you'll notice some differences compared to the previous Mac Mini. One notable area that you'll notice a difference is the fact that you're now lacking 2 Thunderbolt ports, USB-C ports. So this one only has 2, whereas the previous Intel-based Mac Mini had 4. So you do lose a couple of ports, unfortunately, but you do still have 2 standard USB 3.0 ports, which is nice that those are there. We have over here the power button to turn the unit on and off, power cable connection. Then we have a ventilation grill. Again, you have the 2 USB-C and or USB 4.0 ports. So these are the latest USB ports, which is nice. Then we have a HDMI, again the 2 USB 3.0s and the 3.5 millimeter headphone jack, which is another nice thing that is still there. One thing to note with these display ports is the fact that the M1 Mac Mini can only support up to 2 external displays. One has to be connected through HDMI and the other connected through a USB-C port. So unfortunately you cannot have more than 2 displays. I really don't quite understand that. I'm guessing it has to do with a limitation of the actual CPU itself. So now let's go ahead and jump over to some benchmarks. Alright, now let's go ahead and take a look at some benchmarks that I have put together here. So starting off, we're going to take a look at the Geekbench 5 CPU test for single core. The M1 Mac Mini scores right in the ballpark of 1,740, whereas the Intel-based Mac Mini scores right around 1,100. And then I also have put in a third comparison here, which is a 2019 15-inch MacBook Pro with the Intel 8-core processor, and it scores a single core of 1058. So the Mac Mini in this case, in terms of single core, is significantly faster, even when compared to a top spec 15-inch MacBook Pro. Now if we move to the multi-core Geekbench 5 test, the M1 Mac Mini scores 7,394. The Intel Mac Mini scores 4,665. And then that 15-inch MacBook Pro scores 6,075. So again, in this case, the Mac Mini is definitely faster on paper in terms of these numbers. However, in my actual real-world experience, for the real-world tests that I've done in terms of video exports and stuff, the MacBook Pro is actually faster in most cases. So don't always believe what you see in terms of these numbers here. These just kind of give a baseline. Next up is a Cinebench CPU stress test. Essentially what this is doing is maxing out all the cores on the processor and seeing how well it is able to compute the graphical processes from this application. So the Mac Mini scores a 7,704, the Intel Mac Mini 7,100, and then the 15-inch MacBook Pro is 7,998. So in this case, the MacBook Pro is actually faster than the other two, but if you notice, not by very much. The Mac Mini is only a couple hundred points off from that top spec MacBook Pro. So they're very, very close. Next, we're going to take a look at a GFX Bench 1440p gaming test. And in this case, the Mac Mini beat out the other two competitors with a score of a 69 frames per second, whereas the Intel Mac Mini got only 13 frames per second, which is pretty abysmal. And then that 15-inch MacBook Pro got 48 frames a second. So in terms of gaming, the M1 Mac Mini is actually pretty darn good. And that 15-inch MacBook Pro is using the Vega 20 graphics, which is a little bit of an older graphics card at this point, because the 16-inch MacBook Pro has a newer model. All right, now we're taking a look at the SSD speed. So the Mac Mini, in this case, was actually the slowest of the three. So it got a score of 2275 megabits per second. The Intel Mac Mini got 2780 megabits a second, and the MacBook Pro got 2765. So again, not a huge difference, but for some reason the M1 Mac Mini's SSD is just a tad slower than the Intel-based computers. All right, now taking a look at a photo editing test using Lightroom Classic. So in this particular test, I did a 100 raw photo export and measured how long each computer took to export and or render that batch of images. Now these images were captured using a Nikon D850, which each raw photo from that I think is around 50 megabytes a piece. So they're pretty hefty raw photos. So in this case, the M1 Mac Mini rendered them at 4 minutes 10 seconds. The Intel Mac Mini got 6 minutes and 2 seconds, and that 15-inch MacBook Pro did it in the fastest time at 3 minutes 7 seconds. So the M1 Mac Mini is right in between here. So the MacBook Pro is the fastest, and then the M1 Mac Mini is right in the middle, and then the Intel Mac Mini is the slowest, rendering at over 6 minutes. Okay, next up here was a test for stabilization. So I stabilized 1 minute of H.264 1080p video, and the M1 Mac Mini actually did this the fastest. Basically because the encoders built into the Mac Mini are significantly faster. So the M1 finished in 5 seconds, which is really fast. The Intel Mac Mini, 38 seconds, and the MacBook Pro, 7 seconds. So the M1 and the MacBook Pro are actually neck and neck, only about 2 seconds off on that one there. But again, that Intel Mac Mini is significantly slower. So far, we're kind of seeing a pattern here that Intel Mac Mini is much, much slower in effectively all aspects. And the reason for that primarily is the fact that it has the Intel integrated graphics, which is pretty poor at this point. The integrated graphics that is in that Mac Mini is really, really bad and is pretty slow. So that's kind of where the bottleneck is coming from for that computer. Okay, so lastly here is a video export from Final Cut Pro. So what I did was exported a 7-minute clip that is H.264 1080p 60 frames per second. And so in this, we want the numbers to be lower, obviously. So the M1 got a export time of 7 minutes 20 seconds. The Intel Mac Mini 10 minutes 4 seconds, and the MacBook Pro being blazingly fast at 1 minute 46 seconds. So in this case, the 8-core MacBook Pro with the Vega 20 beat out the other two competitors in this particular test, primarily because of the fact that that has a dedicated GPU, whereas these two other both have effectively integrated graphics. The Intel version has pretty poor integrated graphics, whereas the M1 still has integrated graphics, but is way, way better than the Intel version. So anyway, those are some benchmark for the M1 Mac Mini. So that's basically it for this video. Hope you guys have enjoyed. So yeah, with that all being said, hope you guys have enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the